Okay, I am going to get started then. We have a couple minutes before I dive into the briefing itself, just in case people come late. Thank you everyone for coming. It's good to virtually see you. I hope that some of you were able to catch the previous lectures we had over the past few weeks. The first one being with Terry and Finlay, which was about general public speaking tips and how to interpret motions more broadly. And I'm going to use Finlay's framework. Well, I'll review it briefly. And then framework to do the rest of this. What are we doing? Briefing. And then last week we got to hear from Peter Georgiev, who is a producer for Panorama, and he talked to us about kind of research, and that was really interesting as well. But today, as always, we are going to have our motions briefing for the spring tournaments, which are coming up. Sorry that this is a little bit later than usual, but just with scheduling, it's what we had to do. The schedule of the seminar, first, I wanted to give the floor to you all in case you had any questions that I might be able to answer, any feedback you want to give about anything. We have had some changes over the past, over in the fall with more teams and more people per team and longer prep time and impromptu motions on finals. And we had the fiasco at Fall East with the finals. So anything that you guys want to talk about, I would love to talk about that with you now. And then I'm going to do a quick review of what Finlay brought to us during his seminar. And then we'll go through the motions, West first and then East. And this time, because I think that we are ready for this, how it's going to work is I will go through the normal briefing, like me talking at you for one of the motions, and then I'm going to ask that you guys actually help me to group brainstorm how we might interpret the other motion for each of the regions. Because it is sad, but it is true that I will not be here next year, and I don't know if I can guarantee motions briefings, which means that you all need to be, develop the skills to be able to do it by yourselves, which I know that you can. So I'm excited for all of that. So without me rambling,
Julia,
yes,
do you know who is going to be at your position next year?
I do not know.
Okay.
But we will see. They will definitely be trained, and I will help them to adjust. We might be looking for more than one person just because of how big the program's getting. But we will see.
I feel like the top criteria would be someone that is into flowing, right?
Exactly. Thank you. Okay, that's a good question. Other questions, comments, feedback, anything about anything?
I just want to say a huge thank you for the longer prep time for impromptu rounds. That is beautiful. You're great for doing that.
We can, of course, we can also thank Sammy for being a little bit more under pressure with the schedule, but I'm glad that that has worked out. I know that sometimes there have been issues like within a couple minutes of like, oh, there's like a couple 5-minute delays. This time I put official start times because I do want everything to start on time, but I think that 45 minutes has been better debates, and then finals with an hour. I don't know. It's good.
Yeah, for example, my team last time, we didn't actually get like when we should start preparing. Like there was a bit of a confusion. No volunteer had come to our room. So both of the teams were just standing there, and like we lost half of prep time that way.
Okay, I remember, and maybe I'll say this now and I'll remind everybody at the tournaments. So on Sunday mornings, for the fourth round, the second impromptu round, I asked that you guys come at like 8:15 to check to make sure you're all there. And then the motion comes out at 8:45. And as soon as the motion comes out on Sunday mornings, you all should go and start preparing the motion and the sides, even if there isn't a judge in your room, because it's actually intentional. I trust you all to prepare properly without having to be monitored very strictly. And the reason why we're having this happen is so that you all have more time to prepare with that 45 minutes, but the judges can also sleep a little bit. So the judges will come in around 9:15 and we'll have volunteers monitoring as soon as the motion comes out. So Sunday morning, we'll see you at 8:15. And then when the motion comes out at 8:45, go to your rooms and start preparing. That was a miscommunication on my side.
Yeah, thanks for making that clear.
Perfect. Dari, did I see your hand up?
Yeah. When will the program be published?
The West program is up now on the website.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah,
Is it?
I think so. I just checked. Do you want me to go look? Yeah, look.
Because last time they did it like on the Monday before the tournament. So this time it's pretty early on.
Yeah, I think that we were able to finalize it. Let me just double check. Yep, it's up here. It's very similar to last time. I think the only thing that are different are the way that the rounds are broken up for the speech categories because of the participation in, like, we're not as, there are fewer merge categories for West. The East one, it will be a couple weeks because we have to wait for registration to close. Okay, other questions, comments?
How much debaters are we having in the Spring West?
We have 17 plus 20 teams, 37 teams. They're about 3 to 5 each. We're gonna have a lot. Let me see. We might have over 100 debaters. We definitely have 37 teams. So I think over 100.
Well, it's definitely more than 100
Yeah,
if it's 37 teams. So
yeah. That's amazing. That's
are
great.
there a lot of novice teams?
Yeah, 17 novice.
Ooh, that's a lot compared to
Yeah.
last tournament, especially.
Yeah. So everyone please show up. Other questions, comments?
Julie,
Yeah.
I was wondering whether Finley's presentation is going to be uploaded on the YouTube channel because I unfortunately missed it. So
We weren't on Zoom, so I couldn't record it, but I can share the document that he has that he was talking off of. And then if you have questions, you can either ask me or, yeah, you can ask me and I'll forward them to him, but we don't have a recording of it, unfortunately.
okay, that would be great. Thank you.
Okay, let me see if I can attach it here now. I will definitely try to attach it at one point. Other questions? Okay, give me 2 seconds. I think this is a new feature in Zoom, which is cool. Are you going to give a definition for the term metaverse? That's a good question. I actually don't think that I wrote the definition on here, but I have a video that explains what the metaverse is. And I think I left it up to teams to give that actual definition itself. Okay.
Oh, Julia, just before we start, I would really like to thank you and like the team that has prepared the motions, because I feel that in spring the motions are more controversial than they were at fall, and I'm really grateful that the motions are controversial.
Good. I'm glad that you like them. I will say, no, and thank you for mentioning the team, because we do have like a motions committee. It's me, Morgan, Boris, and Chris Totten that we meet, and Terry, of course. We meet for like multiple times to make them. So thank you. I'm glad you like them. And if you don't like them very much, I hope that you enjoy them after this. Okay, let's get started. If at any point you have questions, obviously just interrupt me or raise your hand, or you can put them in the chat and I will do my best to monitor them. So I will do a very quick overview of what Finlay's presentation was. I also put the full length document in the Zoom chat so you can see. And this is kind of how he suggests going about the motions, and I think it was really comprehensive, and it's how we're going to go about them today. So the first thing that he says that we need to ask are, first, what are the key actors and definitions? Who is important in this debate? Sometimes you might also hear the term stakeholder, which are people that have an interest in what happens with the motion. So these can be people that are named, like governments, people, organizations, countries, or they can be people that aren't named but are affected regardless. Sometimes you might also need to define or recognize what the House is. Generally, we can just think of this House believes that as we believe that, but in that one motion, like this House as the environmental movement believes that, then the House is a specific actor that we need to pay attention to. And then regarding definitions, what terms will possibly lead to confusion in the round, and how can we define them fairly as the proposition? And this is generally what we have talked about going in the past, but I like this idea of who is important in this debate. The second question when you're looking at a motion that you should be thinking about is, what is your advocacy? What is each side actually arguing for? In the past, I kind of defined this as like, what is the core of the motion? What is this debate about? But I like this phrasing better, is literally looking down and being like, what does the proposition have to prove or have to argue? Are they arguing that something is bad? Or are they actually arguing that an action is to be taken? So thinking back on that surveillance motion, if you remember, this House would ban workplace surveillance. The proposition was not just arguing that workplace surveillance was bad, but instead they were arguing for an action to be taken of banning workplace surveillance. So they had to prove not just, okay, this is a bad thing, but yes, we need to ban it. And then therefore on the opposition, they didn't have to necessarily say workplace surveillance is good. They just have to say why it should not be banned. So making those distinctions, I think, is really helpful, and we'll work on that today. Third, what could your model look like? We've talked a lot about models. These are sometimes given by the proposition, and this is basically, if you are arguing for something to be done, then what is that going to look like? How will it be implemented, and what are the details that make it like paint the world in which you're advocating for? Some motions that do require, that are more like policy leaning, like banning workplace surveillance or something like that, would have a model, whereas other things that are what we call value motions or value judgments, where you're just talking about, is something good or bad, something we should support or not support, those don't have models and you wouldn't need it. And we'll see both of those types today. And then the last question, which is I think the broadest, but also the most important, is what are the potential impacts and how do we weigh them? So you can think about this kind of in a bunch of different ways. One is when you're looking at the different lenses, so political, economical, environmental, social, whatever the different lens is that you're looking at, kind of thinking broadly about the motion in that way, and then also looking about how each actor or stakeholder is going to be affected in that context. So what are the economic impacts on banning workplace surveillance? What are the social impacts for both the worker and the employer? Things like that. So it's not just, so whenever you're thinking of a motion, you're like, I have no arguments, or like you think this is really imbalanced and the other team is clearly going to win. You want to kind of parse out each of these different lenses. So how could this affect politics, government, the economy, environment, social movements, the rights or morality, all of those things, and trying to think through each of those and seeing which ones are the strongest for your side and the strongest for the other side. So figuring out which of those impacts matter the most in the round and why. So if your strongest impact on the prop side is about the economic implications and the strongest impact on the op side is about the environmental implications, you need to be able to, whether you are prop or op, recognize that and figure out how you can justify, if you're a prop, economy being more important than environment. Do they Does one necessarily supersede the other? Does another does the economic benefit, is that necessary for the environmental benefit to be achieved? So thinking about how we can compare those things, and we've talked a little bit about that, I think last semester, about weighing impacts on terms of like time frame, magnitude, probability, and inevitability. So thinking through all of those. Okay, so that was just a quick summary. I put the full document where he looked also at previous motions from the fall and nationals, I think, of last year, in the Zoom chat. And then we're going to use this framework when we're talking about the motions themselves. But does anybody have any questions before we jump into Spring West? Am I talking too fast? It's okay, I can slow down.
Everything's perfect.
Okay, welcome you on. It's good to see you.
You too.
Okay, Spring West motions. This House would require high carbon emitting countries to compensate poorer, vulnerable countries most harmed by climate change. This one, I realized reading it aloud, lots of big words, maybe novices, younger students, lower English level, you might be a little bit frightened by this, but don't be, it's actually very simple. Well, all the words, whenever you dissect them, make them more simple. And the other one, this House regrets the rise of the metaverse. So as I mentioned, we are going to, well, I will walk you through the first motion using that framework. And then for the metaverse motion, we're going to do it together. So climate change payments. Basically what this motion is talking about is, should rich countries that are causing a lot of the climate crisis, so the US, China, India, Russia, those huge countries that are pumping a bunch of CO2 and other bad emissions into the atmosphere and fueling global warming, should they pay in some form the smaller countries that are getting the brunt of that impact? Think of like island nations, other sorts of countries that are like, I think Pakistan is also another country, I think the UAE and other countries that are not contributing nearly as much, but are receiving the bulk of that impact. So we'll talk about that. So the first question, what are the key actors and definitions? Who is important in this debate? Say the first one are the high carbon emitting countries, those huge countries that are probably causing the issues. And then the poorer, more vulnerable countries that are the most impacted. The reason why we're using these phrases, poorer, more vulnerable, is not to use them in like a discriminatory term, but just to differentiate between countries. So there's, for example, India is both a country that is producing a ton of emissions. I think they're number 3 or 4, and they're also the country that's more impacted by global warming. But the reason why it's phrased this way is so that India can't both be something that's causing the issue and someone that's benefiting from some sort of reparation or payment. So we're looking precisely at countries that we're going to talk about in a slide or two that are not responsible for this issue, but are dealing with the problem. And that's why we have this clarifier of poorer, vulnerable countries that are most harmed. Okay. Who else is important in this debate? The rest of the world, like the global interest in reducing the impact of climate change. So it's not just these countries in a vacuum, but could something like this motion where these countries that are emitting more being disincentivized to emit and kind of changing their policies, could that better the rest of the world by reducing climate change faster or helping to? That's possible. Who is this House? This House, we probably want to give them some backing. So it's probably some sort of international governing body, like the EU, I think I talked about it later, like the EU or the UN or some sort of global agreement that has authority. So thinking back, like the Paris Climate Accords, which were, I think, in like 2014, which was not necessarily a established organization like the UN, but it was a coalition or an agreement with a bunch of different countries that all signed something to do something to make improvements regarding climate change. So the House is some sort of thing that would actually make sure it's done. We don't need to talk about necessarily how much those payments would be or who or like what the enforcement mechanism is, but just the general thing that it's like a good idea. Terms that will possibly lead to confusion in the round, probably having a very agreeable list of countries, and then talking about what it means to compensate, which we're going to do in depth over the next couple slides. Okay, this is this cool map that I found where it, and I'm going to upload the PowerPoint at the end with all the sources and stuff. They're in the notes. But looking at who the top 5, which countries are the most emitting countries, China, the US, India, which I mentioned, Russia, and Japan account for over 60% of global carbon dioxide emissions. So they're the big producers and the big culprits, you might say. So these are most likely the countries we're going to be targeting. Maybe you can add numbers 6 and 7 if you think it's right, but most of the literature or most of what people are talking about is coming and targeting these 5 countries. Thinking about when you're kind of working through this motion, you should be thinking about like, what are their interests? What are the interests of these 5 countries? What are their incentives to or to not pay this amount or to not emit? So like China, I think the US and China like compete for, depending on what metric you use, for like overall emissions versus like year by year emissions. But like China, I think tons of their emissions come from burning fossil fuels in coal production and other sorts of manufacturing. So like their incentive to continue emitting is based on economic reasons and maybe political reasons tied to the economy. So, and they probably don't have an interest in paying money to smaller countries because they still technically, I guess, are being classified as a developing country, but are still developing their economy in a way. And then also thinking about what are the risks that could come with these larger countries making this payment. Does this set the stage for future legal liabilities? So if America and China and Russia all sign this piece of paper that says, okay, yes, we will pay, these 5 small countries for the issues that we have caused, does that mean that the UAE can then sue America in some sort of global court, or maybe an American court being like, hey, 5,000 of our citizens just died and it's your fault because you were pumping CO2 into the atmosphere and it caused droughts or sea level rise or whatever it may be. So thinking about that, and what precedent does this set for other issues? Are countries going to potentially be responsible for other sorts of things that don't directly impact one country or one person, but impact things broadly and then therefore have a residual effect? Does that set the stage? This is pretty like in-depth, but some things to think about. And then looking at the smaller countries, there was a new research study came out last year where 2 people from Dartmouth, one of the Ivies, did a research actually like quantifying the amount of money and the amount of, so like how much the US has made by their carbon emissions and how much other countries have lost because of the impact of global warming. And one of the conclusions is like, it's the countries that have emitted the least that are also the ones that tend to be harmed by increases in global warming, which is unfortunate. So they identifies the highest financial losses overall because of global warming: Brazil, India, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Indonesia. And then looking at the highest loss based on GDP. So this is more of like, okay, these countries are much smaller and it's disproportionately affecting them: the UAE, Mauritania, Saudi Arabia, Oman, and Mali. So when you're talking, and this is that research study, when you are having this debate, I don't necessarily think that we should go down to like, does Oman count as one of the small countries? I don't think we should be hyper focusing on the specifics of what countries would or would not be included, but thinking more broadly on like, is this the right thing to do? Is this a right policy? And you'll see whenever you do your own research, this is something that's been discussed for like the past like very, very long time. So the smaller countries have been advocating for it for like 30 years. And but it's picked up a lot of steam over the past like 5 years in a lot of the global climate talks. So you'll be able to read and see it, not in the nitty gritty details, but in the big picture stuff. I just wanted to give this to you just for, I guess, something to put your finger on. Questions so far? Okay.
Well, it's not really a question, but I think that what you mentioned, I'm kind of seeing that a lot of the debates would end up being like a debate on definition if that specific country applies to the definition, and I'm kind of worried that that may happen.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, and that's kind of what I was trying to prevent or say with like the last 30 seconds was like, please, like when you're thinking about this debate, it does not necessarily matter whether or not like Oman is included in those smaller, poorer, more vulnerable countries. So we don't want to be debating those individual inclusions of the countries, as long as it's fair and reasonable and not something crazy. Like we would never want to include China as a country that would be able to benefit from like compensation, because they're the one that is like, you know what I mean? They're the biggest emitter. But generally we're thinking, is it a good idea? Is it right? Or should we require that big countries pay the smaller countries for this issue? So please don't go into those debates, because it's an unnecessary debate and is far away from the core. Maria?
Yeah, hi. I just wanted to ask, do countries like Bulgaria and Romania, for example, which are part of a union, but are still maybe poorer than other West European countries and are also harmed by climate change, apply also to the definition? Because that creates the issue whether other countries should pay or compensate their actions to the whole union or individually to such countries.
I think that's a good question. And I would point you probably, I don't know why I can't see. Oh, here it is. I would point you, and that's kind of why we have so many qualifiers, right? Qualifiers being poor, vulnerable, most harmed by climate change. And I don't think that Bulgaria or Romania would count, at least in terms of what I've read, as the countries that are most harmed by climate change. Typically, they're like island countries or the ones that I mentioned before. So I don't think we're going to get into that debate of like the union, whether or not the amounts are being paid to the union, because I don't think the EU countries are the ones that are suffering. I think maybe the African bloc is in there. It would be in there, but I don't think that there's any sort of, I don't think we need to get into those details.
Yeah, my question was overall about unions and stuff, but yeah, I get it. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Other questions? Okay, let's talk about, oh, yep, Kalyan.
Well, I believe that if you can make a point of Bulgaria being vulnerable and a poor nation that's very affected by the environmental changes, I believe that you can use it as kind of your argument for the debate. But I believe if you can back it only with evidence, that's the case.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, and something that I would also kind of reiterate, I guess, or like encourage you, is I think that this, you'll see, even if you do like a basic Google search and you read like the first 5 articles or something, you'll see that it's the same groups of countries that are being talked about on both sides. Like the high carbon emitting countries are generally the same. The poorer, more vulnerable countries are generally the same. So you're looking for what's happening in a majority of the research. So what are most experts talking about? Which countries are they talking about? And let's focus on those, because that's where we're going to get the good debate, because that's like the realistic debate. So even if you could find somewhere that does say Bulgaria is one of those countries, I don't think that a majority of experts would agree with that. So try to do the research first and then draw your conclusion of which countries would make sense, as opposed to trying to pick a country and make it fit in there.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. And maybe actually, and I have more time now, because if you guys remember last year, I would put some articles up. So I will put some articles up on the tournament portal, maybe tomorrow, if not on Wednesday, with suggested reading to get you started. Okay. Okay, let's move on just for the sake of time. If you have questions that I did not get to right now, you can hold on to them and we'll do it at the end. So then the other word that we want to take a look at is compensate. And you'll again see in the research, see in like these articles that there are a few different ways that they describe ways that it could be compensate. Generally though, we're talking about some sort of monetary, some sort of money or that's being paid. It's not in terms of like giving them more resources or credits. It's like, okay, there will be money transferred in one way or another from the top 5 to the lowest. Sometimes it's being discussed as direct financial compensation. So like here, we will give you this lump of cash. Others, there are these things called loss and damage funds, which are kind of like insurance policies. So countries like China, US, and Russia would pay almost like a tax into a general fund that could be sent out or distributed if natural disasters occur that can be tied to climate change. So it's a little bit like more managed. And then you also might hear the term climate reparations. Reparations are the idea that people or groups should be paid for things that have been done against them that are wrong. So this is a little bit more politically charged, and it's the idea that, hey, it's really not fair that, I think there's an example of like Pakistan having like awful, I think there was flooding recently where thousands of their citizens died, and Pakistan is a very low emitting country. And that's obviously a humanitarian like disaster. It's very awful and very sad. And some may argue that they deserve reparations, or the idea that they deserve to be compensated because they are those victims. So you might hear or see all of these in terms of compensation. Again, do your reading, and for the model itself, that will be where the proposition can kind of like define it. Yeah, Maria.
Just a quick question. Are those kinds of monetary compensations paid like on average each month, like a tax, like a number that is calculated on the average emission of CO2, or is it going to be like depending on the, for example, monthly emissions of CO2 produced by the country, or determined by the magnitude of the climate catastrophe that has struck a country that is vulnerable and harmed by climate change?
I think that there's not a specific solution. I think about all of those, some version of all of those are being discussed now. There was a conference in November, a climate conference in November, where this issue was spoken about a lot and they talked about it. So I would say read and see where the direction is going. I think that the biggest ones would be some sort of like lump payment or commitment to pay. So not necessarily like a month by month tax, but like you need to pay $10 billion by 2035 from the United States into some sort of fund or to X country that has experienced this disaster. But I don't think that a specific mechanism has been decided on. Okay. Some things you can think about on the op side is, or on both sides, I guess, is how do we combat bad governance? So some of the issues that some of the high carbon emitting countries have are like, we have given them money. Like this is the argument that is being made. We have given them money and the money hasn't been spent correctly or well enough, or there's issues or concerns of corruption, stuff like that. So you might see that on one side or the other. Things to think about in terms of like what that compensation would, what the impact of that compensation would look like. Okay, next, what is your advocacy? So what is each side actually arguing for? In this, we'll see that the prop needs to say that, yes, these payments should be mandatory and they should be substantial enough to compensate those countries. So it's not just saying that, oh, it's a good idea and it is very sad that the countries, you know, are being harmed and it's probably the bigger country's fault. But beyond that, therefore, these payments must be made. And the opposition needs to say that, no, the payments should not be required. They're a bad idea for XYZ reasons. Or maybe they're a good idea, but they should be voluntary and not something that we should require. Three, what could your model look like? This, I think, is going to be directed by the research that you do with your team in terms of what makes the most sense. Making sure that on the proposition, you need to not make, it needs to still be like a substantial payment. You can't like make some small, like, we'll give $10 each time a natural disaster occurs. Like, that's not cool. Like, it needs to be something substantial. You'll read about what they're talking about in the articles. And potentially, if you wanted to, how would it be enforced? The UN, the EU, the global climate accords, like the Paris Agreement. We'll see. And then what are the potential impacts and how do we weigh them? I'm just going to throw these out here and not spend too much time on it because this is the longest motion and I don't want to spend, I want to make sure we're giving enough time to everything else. Thinking, and we've mentioned this a little bit, what are the risks of like liabilities politically and legally? Is there an element to like global compromise that could be a good idea because of global agreements about climate change? Do particular blocks of countries, like I mentioned, like the African Union, do they have an interest in this? Or could they benefit from this in other ways? Obviously, what are the economic benefits and harms to the actors? So how will this benefit the smaller countries? How will it harm the bigger countries? How might this help to serve the environment by having adaptation and recovery efforts being funded so that if something bad happens or if there's a need to build dams or to build irrigation networks or to pump out water because of global warming, and this can now be funded in those smaller countries because of this requirement, how does that help the environment? How might it create a disincentive for countries to continue emitting or create a perverse incentive in that if countries think that all they have to do is shell out $1 million or $1 billion, they can keep emitting? Might this make global warming better or worse? And how will this aid affect communities positively or negatively? When you're thinking about these things, and I hope many others, this was just what I came up with on the top of my head, well, after doing research, but thinking about what sorts of these impacts matter the most on both sides and how you can justify one over the other. Questions about this motion? Okay, then let's move on. We're gonna talk about the metaverse. I have this video, I think it's like 3 minutes, that explains the metaverse better than I will. So we're gonna watch this and then we'll keep going with the breakdown, but I'm gonna ask you guys to help. So let me make sure that it's sharing the video too.
What actually is the metaverse? Well, if we think of the internet as something that we look at, the metaverse is a version of the internet that we're inside. The idea is that we will experience the metaverse as an avatar, a virtual version of ourselves that we control as we explore this new online frontier. But what will we actually do?
Okay, so Boz, here we are in what might be considered a representation of what the metaverse could be.
Yeah, for us, the metaverse is a spatial construct as opposed to the previous web, which was really a very linear kind of 2D flat thing. We want this one to be immersive. Now, of course, it doesn't mean it has to be virtual reality. It could also just be on a phone or on a desktop computer.
You might have noticed that we're using the tools of the metaverse to create a good portion of this item. My avatar has been created by a couple of companies, Ready Player Me and Oz. They already create tools for people to make avatars from a photo. It's this virtual version of us which will travel between online experiences in any metaverse.
And then over time, what I'm most excited about is an economy there. And I mean, economy not just of digital goods, sure, and entertainment, that's great, but also services. In an immersive environment, I'm going to have an avatar. I'm going to need a stylist. I'm going to have a home space.
Microsoft has adapted its workplace meeting software Teams for the metaverse by creating a system called Mesh. It's designed to work with a variety of different devices, including virtual and augmented reality. AR, as it's known, projects graphics on top of the real world using headsets like Microsoft's HoloLens or mobile phones. There's quite a few people that have got fatigued by having to have video chat meetings and things of that nature, and that they realise they now crave human contact.
Human communication is about 5%, speech is about 95% everything else. I've been in my living room with the entire team around the table, right? Making eye contact, where all the gestures are coming into the right place. So it changes completely the call it the screen fatigue we're feeling today.
The next piece of the metaverse puzzle isn't just about seeing these virtual worlds, but feeling them as well. Meta has revealed that it's been working on a glove that will let the user feel sensations like holding an object. The glove has a number of sensors that measure the wearer's movements, and air pockets across the glove surface inflate to create sensation. These gloves aren't quite ready for prime time yet, but they're an indicator of the kind of research that's going on behind the scenes.
Okay. I don't know if anyone has seen or read Ready Player One, but that last thing was really giving me that vibe. So that is, I think, a very general overview of the metaverse. As I said, I don't think I put a definition in here. That was a oversight. I don't know what the right word is. But I think it's the idea of having that sort of like immersive environment. It's not just virtual reality in which you enter like a computer game and it's like this simulated world, but it's like an entire space in which you are interacting with others. There might be an economy. You might be able to buy virtual real estate, put up businesses, buy and sell avatars, things like that. So it's a little bit more than just like entering into a virtual video game, because there's that like
what actually
questions on that before we move into the motion, or if anyone wants to add anything, if anyone's like a metaverse expert. Okay, then let's walk through this, and I would love, please, if everyone can try to...
I just want to say that everyone should watch Ready Player One before doing this debate. It's really spot on.
Yes, and read the book. The book is so good. In terms of the writing is okay, but the descriptions in the book are really, really good. So agreed with that. I'll put the name in the chat. Okay, so what we're going to do... Oops, ready. So what we're going to do, I'm going to ask for you all to help me with this. You can put in the chat or please raise your hand and I'll call on you. So who is important in this debate? What are the key actors? Who are the stakeholders, the key actors? And the motions at the bottom so you guys can see. What groups of people will be affected by the metaverse? Come on, don't be shy. Yep, go ahead, Kellyanne.
Probably the public and also the big companies that are working on developing the software for the metaverse.
Perfect. Society and tech companies. Exactly. I don't know if I have another one. Yep, that's exactly what I had. Okay, who is this house? I'm going to give this one to you because it's kind of would be obtuse otherwise. This is one of those motions where you can just interpret the house as like we. Like, we regret the rise of the metaverse. Therefore, you as the judge, if you believe that the metaverse is not, should not, it's not bad, but like the world would be better without the metaverse, then vote for prop, or obviously the inverse. Okay, what terms are important to pull out and should be defined? What are the key terms in this motion? Katerina?
Yeah, metaverse and thrice as well.
Okay. I'm looking for one more word.
Regret.
Yes, exactly. I would say that regrets and the metaverse are the most important. The rise is just like a phrase we use, like how this is coming up and coming. So when we're looking at a regrets motion, this is what we're talking about, is that we are doing a comparison of the world with or without the object of the motion, the object of the sentence being the metaverse. So which world is better? One in which the metaverse exists and one in which it does not exist. Yeah, Rosen.
Yeah, Julia, my question is, doesn't the word regret kind of imply that this rise has already happened? Whereas I believe that the metaverse still has a long way to go. So like, I kind of want you to define the definition a bit more.
Yeah, that's a good point. And that's kind of why this phrase, like regrets the rise, is a very common phrase in debate motions, because it's something that doesn't necessarily, it has started, but you're right, it hasn't fully reached its capacity. So what we're talking about is there in the proposition world, we're saying the world would be better if the metaverse had never existed and would never exist in any capacity. And on the op, we're trying to say that, like, no, the metaverse as it exists now and potentially where it will develop are generally a good thing. So that's like in tandem, you're thinking, what does the world look like if this never existed versus actually present day? Maria.
I just wanted to ask, isn't rise also an important word? Like, could someone basically interpret the motion that they don't regret the concept of the metaverse, but the rising popularity of the metaverse and investments in the metaverse?
Yeah, I think that that's part of it. I mean, I think that, yes, that should be included. Like, this is not a good way for people to invest their money or for society to invest in money. I don't think we should hyper focus on the word rise, because again, I think that the reason why it's in the motion is because it's talking about this is something that is developing. And again, we're looking, prop is saying this should not, like, the world would be better without it ever having existed or developing, and op saying, no, as it is continuing now and will continue in the future, this is a better thing to have in the world. Okay, what is your advocacy? What is each side actually arguing for? Okay, is prop arguing for some action to be taken? Are they arguing that something is bad? How would you phrase the prop advocacy? I kind of have done it a couple times over the past couple minutes. What does the prop side have to prove or show? Yep, go ahead, Katerina again.
That they regret the rise of the metaverse.
Good. Can you try to use different phrases or put it in your own words?
Well, give me a second to think about it.
Yeah, go ahead.
Should I say it as a team line or something, or?
You can give me an example of a team line, that works.
Okay. This house, let's say, finds the rise of the metaverse bad, or thinks that the world would be better without the metaverse. Yep.
Beautiful. That's exactly what I was looking for. You read my mind. Exactly. Prop must prove that we, aka the world, would be better off if the metaverse never existed. Op is just proving the opposite, which I think we've talked about. Very good. And then what could your model look like? This is one of those motions where there is not a model. It's a value judgment. We're just evaluating which world is better. So we're not instituting a plan. The prop isn't arguing for something to be done. It's just saying, hey, we don't think the metaverse was a great thing. Okay, let's hear about some potential impacts. Oops, I gave you one for free. How do we think that the metaverse, and whether or not exists or not, what impacts are associated with them? Where is the metaverse gonna? Yep. Go ahead, Katerina, and other people, while Katerina is sharing, please feel free to type in the chat or also raise your hand.
Well, workplace, studies, the tech world as well, you know. Then the rise of the Bitcoin.
Mm-hmm.
So, others.
That's a good start. Let's hear from others too, please. Thank you. I think Bitcoin is a good example because of the idea of like commerce. So are people going to be able to buy and sell things in the metaverse? Is that going to be using things like cryptocurrencies? A lot of that is talked about in Ready Player One. Entertainment, are people not going to go to the movies anymore and just meet up in the metaverse? How is this going to affect the global economy? AKA, are people going to start buying up virtual properties and virtual real estate that are going to go for like millions and billions of dollars? Thinking also about like NFTs, all of that is wrapped up in the metaverse or could be. How is this going to contribute to economic inequality? Are people that are going to be able to afford to buy more power-ups and more things in virtual world? Is that going to affect real world? It's very interesting. And then when you're thinking of these things, evaluating what impacts matter the most. Okay, questions about the metaverse motion? Okay, I think for this one, it's going to be, I think you'll find some good articles to read, but I also think that some of these videos that I've just found on YouTube are also going to be really interesting, especially because Facebook pivoted, like a year ago to Meta, and they're really doing a lot of investments in the metaverse. I think that that's interesting. And then quickly reviewing the impromptu hints for West, it's the first one, or any order, but art and culture, sociology, and relations. These are like interpersonal relationships, like relations between people. I don't think that there's much needed to prepare on that side, but. Okay, that is Spring West. I'm sorry for the late hour. We are running a little bit behind, but if you have to duck out, you can always catch the recording later. For our West participants, I encourage you to stick around if you can, because working through motions is always beneficial. Any questions before we move on to the East motions? Also, for some reason, I cannot see the chat, so I don't know if anyone has posted anything in there. Sorry, Daria, I saw. I missed that. Education, healthcare, economic services. Yes, for some reason, I could not see whenever my screen was shared. Okay. If someone can let me know, someone whose mic is working, when there's something in the chat, please do, because I can't see them anymore. Okay, the Spring East, this house supports trying juveniles as adults, and this house believes developed countries should not accept skilled migrants from developing countries. I will go through the juveniles as adults, and then we'll go through the developed countries together. So this motion, if you did not catch it, is about criminal justice. So people being tried in court, kids being tried as adults for like serious crimes. The key actors and definitions, the people, the stakeholders that you should imagine. Oh, I see a chat. Okay, thanks for coming, Talion. Okay, who is important in this debate? Who is this going to impact? First, juvenile criminals and juveniles that are being charged with or accused of crimes. The victims of crimes, typically when juveniles, which is like kids, are being typically when kids are being tried for adults, it's about violent crimes. So like murder, assault, death, things like that. And the other important actor are the criminal justice system. So how does the criminal justice, this isn't necessarily an actor, but like a stakeholder, like how would this sort of support affect what happens in criminal justice overall? And then also communities and society who are going to be impacted, whether or not the juvenile is not tried as an adult and is released into society, either prepared or not prepared to enter, and also how they are going to be reacted if a 15-year-old kid is sent to adult prison and let out 20 years later and is completely like not ready or prepared to go into the real world again. So thinking about that. Who is this house? We, and therefore you. So like we support trying juveniles as adults, therefore you, the judge, should support that. Terms that will possibly lead to confusion. Probably a fair definition of what a juvenile is. I would say probably somewhere 10, 11, 12, up until like 16 or 17. That's the core issue of like, if a 14 or a 15-year-old commits a crime, like, should they be tried as an adult? 17, 18, I think usually they are anyway. So it's mostly about that like younger age. And then also we'll talk about it in the model. Just thinking about this now, and I'll make an announcement at the tournament itself, but if you were debating this motion and you intend to talk about any sort of like sensitive issues, please give a trigger warning before you start your speech, or maybe even at the beginning of the debate, and be prepared not to talk about something that could potentially trigger your opponents or your judges. Well, I think that those arguments might be relevant. I think it's just making sure that we're aware of like sensitive topics we might be talking about in terms of violent crime. So we'll talk about that again at the tournament, but something to make sure of before your speeches or before the debate itself, if that's something your team is going to be talking about. If everyone's picking up what I'm putting down. Okay. Okay, next. What is your advocacy? What does the prop actually have to argue in the op? The prop is saying that, yes, juveniles should be able to be tried as adults in a majority of cases. So this is something that's really important and something to frame debate generally, but especially this is a good example of it, is that the prop has to defend the motion in a majority of cases. So the prop can't just be like, hey, look at this really awful 16-year-old and what they did. They should be tried as an adult and therefore you should vote for our team. Instead, they have to argue based on like the entire idea that for specific types of crimes or for circumstances that like repeated offenses or whatever it might be, juveniles being tried as adults should definitely be on the table. Not that every 15-year-old that commits a car crash that, hurt somebody significantly should be tried as an adult, but like it should be something that should be considered. The majority of cases is the biggest point. And the op is saying that no, juveniles should basically never be tried as adults. The reason why I have basically never is because, say, for example, there's a 17-and-a-half-year-old that commits a violent crime. I think that that's not necessarily what the core of this debate is talking about, whether that 17-and-a-half-year-old should be tried as an adult because they're basically an adult. They're saying, in general, this is something that we should really, really not do. And we're talking not about those outlier cases, but about the majority, the middle, stuff like that. Questions about how I'm framing this? Yeah.
So today I checked, and juvenile in different states is considered in different age groups. So this debate will be focusing on kids that are aged, you said 10 to 17, right?
Yeah, I mean, I would say maybe 10 might be a little bit younger. I would say probably 12 to 17 is a good range. But if you do a bunch of research and a lot of your arguments are stemming from like one particular age group, like it's 14 to 16 that they're talking about, or whatever it is, whatever you're finding most of your research, finding most of the support, as long as it's fair.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. And say, for example, you on the proposition are like, we define juvenile as 12 to 16, and the opposition gives a case, gives an example of an 11-year-old committing something, a violent crime, you know what I mean, or doing something. We shouldn't be having a debate about whether or not that 11-year-old can be included in your 12 to 16 definition, right? We're thinking broadly, does this example represent generally what the debate is discussing? Yeah, Rosa.
Yes, just going back to sort of clarify maybe this house or where we're arguing. So because this is a question that's rooted in how any given legal system operates. Now, I don't know the Bulgarian system well as like a one-to-one comparison, but I know that the American system is pretty unique worldwide for general incarceration rates, general sort of length of sentencing, or how crimes get handled, whether juvenile or adult. So like, how do we ground, or like what sort of neutral or hypothetical country are we working from, or like do we need to base this in one given judicial system?
I think that's a really good point, and something that's kind of difficult for me to like dictate. I would say that, so the idea of World Schools Debate, like this format, is that like we could go and invite people from like 30 different countries to come and have a debate about this topic. So with that being said, we want to be talking about something that is or could be applicable in not every country, but like, I guess like at the, like a general criminal justice system. So I would discourage a proposition team from trying to isolate one specific country, like in Bulgaria or in the United States, and talk about generally what the merits are of the actual action itself. What could be the merits of trying juveniles as adults? And you can use examples from the US about, why it's good or bad, or examples from this country that has a model judicial or criminal justice system. But thinking about how you can make arguments generic enough that like, if you were to have 30 countries coming in here and having this discussion, it would be kind of a fair discussion to have. I know that that's not really a great answer, but it's kind of how I've come to understand how to approach what you're asking. Can I re-clarify that? Is that good or still confusing?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, that's good. That helps. I wasn't sure if I was supposed to respond again.
No, you're good. You're good. Anybody else?
Well, I personally think that this question really applies to, for example, like the different teams will have different examples. And if those examples are from different countries, then are those examples like reliable if we're kind of comparing the American system to the Bulgarian one?
Yeah,
so I think that's where the problem arises, not really in the motion itself.
Yeah, and I think that that's a good point, and I think that's where your kind of debating skills will come in, and your like critical thinking skills of being like, are we comparing apples to oranges, and like therefore these comparisons shouldn't be compared head to head. I'll tell you why my example fits more of this motion and their example does not make as much sense, or what circumstances make their example a very, outlier example, whereas mine is being, more talked about in the general sense. So kind of as a debater in those situations, being able to identify whether or not the examples can be compared, whether they can't be, and then weighing the merits of both depending. Okay, let's move on. Then I just had prop be fair. Again, you're talking about majority of the sense. You're not saying this one really, really terrible person needs to be tried as an adult, therefore vote for us, which I already said. What could your model look like? This, I think, is something that you should be thinking about of the prop, but not something you need to be overly rigid about. So generally, you should be thinking about, like, what does this world look like? What would be acceptable? What types of cases or crimes should juveniles be eligible to be tried as adults? Is there a minimum age? Are there special protections that should be given to minors? So should there be like a guaranteed opportunity for appeal, which means that you can say, like, ask for another look at your trial if you're found guilty? Should there be a guaranteed opportunity for parole, or the idea that if X number of years have passed, you get the chance to show how you've like demonstrated remorse and been rehabilitated and are ready to enter society earlier than what your sentence was? Did something like this need to be decided by a judge versus a jury? All of these are things that I've been reading about. The other thing that you should be thinking about is death penalty. I think that could be roped up in here, which I talk about later. So the potential impacts, the impact on society or communities, the impact of promoting rehabilitation, which is the idea that we should be helping people get better and learn from their crime, rather than retribution, which is the idea that people should be punished for that crime, and that the fear of punishment will deter or like disincentivize people from committing that crime elsewhere or in the future. Generally, this is an important issue because the idea of the juvenile criminal justice system is about rehabilitation somewhat. So it's about going to classes and going to school and maybe having psychological help so that juveniles can be corrected, I think is the term that's used, so that when they are able to enter society, they are more prepared and less likely to commit crimes. So that's rehabilitation is like juvenile crime. Retribution is a lot of adult crime where it's just like, nope, you did this bad thing, go sit in a cell. Do kids deserve certain rights? What are the dangers of putting minors in adult jail? Are we going to put a 12-year-old in a prison with a bunch of older people that might harm them? Questions of the death penalty, morality, stuff like that. And again, you don't need to talk about all of these impacts, but these are just things that you can think about that could guide your arguments. If anyone has things that they'd like to add, they're welcome to, but I kind of just threw those out there. Yep, Yanni.
I just want to ask, how relevant is it to talk about and engage with the death penalty? Because I kind of feel that it deters from the original point of the debate and it gets into another side debate that I don't think is what the core of this motion is about. So I just want to ask if that's really something that we should be actively engaging with, or more so trying to take it out of the debate.
I think that that's something that I would say is fair game, because the idea, I don't think it should be the center of the debate, but I think it could be an argument for opposition, being like, trying juveniles as adults means that protections for juveniles go away, which means that we could be opening up the death penalty for a child that has committed a crime at the age of 13 or 14 to be sentenced to death. And that's a very serious implication of trying juveniles as adults. So I don't think it's an argument. I don't think that that argument would play out in terms of like, is the death penalty moral? But trying juveniles as adults has a legitimate risk of putting children in danger of being executed for a crime they committed as children. And I think that that is part of this motion. So we're not arguing death penalty good or bad. It's like, there is a reality that the death penalty exists in some countries, and trying juveniles as adults could lead to that reality. Other questions or thoughts on this motion? I think that this is going to be a really interesting debate. I hope that it plays out as I think. I think it's a very interesting discussion overall, so outside of debate context. So I'm looking forward to hopefully sitting in and listening. And I know the judges are too. Okay, last one, skilled migrants. This House believes developed countries should not accept skilled migrants from developing countries. This is a little similar to the motion I think we had last year with nationals about accepting refugees, but it's different obviously about who's coming, but still that like power balance between developed countries and non-developed countries or developing countries. So I'm asking for your help. Who are the key actors? Who's important in this debate? Who are the stakeholders? Yep, Kathy?
So clear stakeholders to me would be the migrants themselves, the countries that they are coming from, and the countries that are accepting or not accepting them.
Very good. How about one more layer of that? So you talked about the migrants themselves. Who are the other like individuals, people that matter?
Other residents in the countries, like both the country that they're leaving and the country that they're going to.
Perfect, agreed. So the countries as them as a whole, and then the skilled workers, domestic and foreign, and I think I forgot to include the last one, which I just asked you, which is the other residents or other workers in those countries. Who is the House? We, aka you, the judge. We believe that developed countries should not accept skilled migrants. Key terms that we want to pull out that we would want to define or that would lead to confusion. Kathy, yeah, go ahead again.
Well, skilled migrants, I think. And also a definition or an example of developed countries and developing countries would be fair game, I think. And I think we should be allowed a model on should not accept, maybe.
Okay, thanks for reading my mind. Okay, perfect. I think defining what who skilled migrants are. Generally, everybody skilled versus unskilled workers are general terms that we use to describe either professions or migrants, people that move from one country to another. So skilled migrants are people that might have certain college degrees. Yep, expats. Skilled migrants are people that have probably college or postgraduate degrees, so PhDs, JDs, doctors, that are going to work jobs that require that sort of education. So somebody that might go and work as at a technology firm or a financial firm or at a university, versus unskilled migrants are people that obviously are not unskilled in and of themselves, but it's just a term to describe people that could go work in a job that doesn't require that degree. So somebody that works in the service industry, a restaurant, or drives a truck, or does those jobs that don't require advanced degrees. What is your advocacy? So what does the proposition have to defend or argue for? How could you put this in your own words? Anyone want to try? I've rephrased it as the prop must agree that it is better, probably for all stakeholders or majority of stakeholders, for developed countries to not accept these skilled migrants. So generally, this is something that is better for the developed countries, the developing countries, the migrants themselves. This is overall a good, better policy. The model, let's see if I gave you a model. Kathy, you said that you would want to have a model about this. Do you have an idea of what that model would include?
Not necessarily as of now, no, I'm sorry.
That's okay, just curious. I said that it's probably not needed besides clarifying terms. I don't necessarily think, because we're not advocating for something to be like, yeah, we're saying that this, developed countries should no longer accept skilled migrants, but I don't think that we need to define, because there's not really any gray area. It's just like, Germany will no longer take, I don't know. Germany will no longer take skilled workers from XYZ country. Those jobs will now instead go to Germans or legally. Yeah, to Germans. Okay, potential impacts. Please put some in the chat. What could be some impacts on any of those actors? Again, if we're having trouble thinking of how this would impact, think about those actors or those stakeholders. How would this policy impact developed countries? How would in fact impact the migrants, the developing countries? Rosen asks, does that mean that people who are skilled will no longer be allowed to emigrate? I think it means instead that like there wouldn't be specific visas that would be targeted for skilled workers. So for example, in America, there are specific visas that you need to have a work permit to go and work. So countries can, or companies can target potential immigrants for those visas. I think that if people are skilled and come to the country for other reasons, and I guess not for the purpose, solely the purpose of work, it would be fine. Or like they would be allowed, but I think it's mostly like that visa economy. Yeah, Maria.
If someone tries to give an example of a developed and developing country that is within the premises of the European Union, as a person from the other side, how do we respond to that? Because in the EU, people shouldn't be restricted not to live somewhere else and work somewhere else. And this is a specific case. And I just want to know, how would we respond if somebody gives such an example?
I think that's a really great question. And I actually am going to have to take it, think about it, do some research and get back to you. I'll post it in the, once I think about that more, because I think that's a really good point. And we'll post it in this event page and also in the Discords, because I'm not sure actually.
Thank you.
That's me. Okay, what are some impacts? How could this policy impact the various actors or stakeholders? Yep, Sky. I'm having trouble hearing you. Do you want to type in the chat maybe, or if you want to mess around with the microphone? It could leave locals without jobs. Yeah. Skilled migration typically trades off with locals that are looking for work. Good. Thank you. Other impacts. Yanni?
Well, pretty intuitively, on the other hand, it deprives skilled workers of a better working quality and a quality of life generally, like better pay, better salary, that kind of stuff.
Yep, very good. Maria?
Yeah, it could leave developing countries without specialists in specific areas.
Which direction? What could lead to that?
If they are on the other side allowed to leave developed countries, yeah.
You could look up the term brain drain, which you might have heard of before, which is the idea that skilled workers or educated workers from developing countries leave their country, which leaves a perpetual cycle that there's never development in the developing countries, which it just creates further inequality. Yanni, do you have something else to add, or is your hand just still up?
I just forgot to put it down.
Okay, very good. These are some good things. We talked specifically about, I think we were, the ones that you guys suggested were a lot on the people themselves, like individuals, the migrants, the local workers. we also should not forget to look at how this will affect the countries as a whole, economically, socially, and politically. How does this kind of migration affect the local as in terms of like the country of the developed and the developing countries? How does it affect society and social interactions, political interactions, etc.? The impact on the domestic economy, impact on the global economy and migration. Say, for example, I don't know exactly which countries are considered developing, but say, for example, the United States, which is like a huge driver of innovation and technology and et cetera, stopped accepting skilled migrants from other countries or from developing countries. How might that innovation be hindered? Or how is that going to just create a bigger divide between developed countries and developing countries? So if the US is only accepting skilled workers from other developed rich countries, is that just going to create a further divide globally? And I think that there are a bunch of others, but those were the main ones that I thought of, and obviously going to weigh them. Questions on this motion? I will take that EU migration thing and think about it and issue a formal statement. Okay, the impromptu hints. I'm very excited about these impromptu motions. Wink, wink. Drug policy, education, and wealth disparities. They're not as scary as they seem. Don't worry. And that is it. I apologize for this running late. I appreciate all of you guys. I will stick around if anyone has any questions. I see Rosa. Otherwise, I will see you all at regionals. Again, the West tournament schedule is up. The East registration closes February 5th. And what else? I don't have any other announcements. So thank you all very much. I will stick around if anyone has questions or other things that they want to talk about, starting with Rosa.
Yes, I assume for the impromptu motions for East, they are written as they're written, and to ask for more would give something away. But just if I may ask, whether or not you could say, when you say drug policy, is that more toward medical drugs or recreational drugs?
I think I would have said pharmaceutical policy for medical drugs. So I would say more recreational.